I see the value to some extent of the existing classification, and as yet don't see any real viable alternatives to it. So I suppose a slight difference in our position might be that I wouldn't really see total rejection of the current classification at the moment as a realistic aim, aspiration or goal. I would see the more realistic way to go as one of trying to build upon, augment or potentially significantly alter the current classification based upon scientific evidence as and when it comes through. But approaches to classification and ways of judging whether or not something meets a particular criterion change over time. When I was a house officer, people were diagnosed as having a heart attack, for example, by having serial abnormalities on electrocardiograms and or raised cardiac muscle enzymes in their blood, whereas now it's just a single blood test of troponin. So, how these things are done changes over time, hopefully led by scientific advance, but also by how wider concerns like how the whole field is approached. Absolutely.
My own view is that we can't do without classification. I don't think any scientific endeavour, in fact probably any endeavour involving human beings, can be managed without some degree of classification.
I think that's right, yeah.
We do it all the time, naturally.
I agree on that, yeah.
There's a philosopher called John Dupre who's written quite a lot about biological classification, and he has this kind of nice concept which I think maybe we should embrace. He calls it promiscuous realism. So his idea is that the world has structure, whichever bit of the world we're interested in, whether it's psychiatric problems or it's species or whatever. But the structure might be too complicated for us to actually have a sort of one-size classification system which fits all purposes. And that leads to the kind of interesting thought, which is, what are the purposes of psychiatric classification? And it's possible, in fact I think it's very likely, that different classification systems will work for different purposes.
Pretty clearly, there is no way of knowing whether one approach or another is right, in quotes. It's just a question of matter. It's a question of what works best in a given scenario for a particular issue or to deal with a particular problem. I think it might also differ. I think we might end up in a situation where it could be different for different psychiatric disorders, if I can even call them that. So that, I'm primarily a psychosis researcher on SIU, Richard, and I think we might end up with a different way of approaching classification there than, for example, when we're dealing with anxiety or depression, which might come back to your point about there might be a difference between public mental health and addressing really common disorders that affect large numbers of the population and affecting what I would see that at least a relatively small number of people with psychosis. It is true that in medicine generally, we do treat social problems with medical approaches. Partly that is, I don't want to make an apology for that or an excuse for it in some ways, because I'm a doctor and that's kind of what you're trained to do. You're trained to deal with the patient in front of you. And if they're living in a damp house and they've got asthma as a consequence of it, you can't really in the consulting room do much about their damp house, but you can give them an inhaler to help deal with the symptoms of it. And so, yes, it's fundamentally wrong that is the case, but as a doctor faced with a particular patient, pragmatically you do what you can. Yes, we do medicalise psychological distress. That is, in a sense, that's the whole approach, that's the whole rationale.
There are still groups, particularly BME groups, who are overrepresented in compulsory treatment settings. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't think there is any evidence that I'm aware of for what is sometimes called institutional racism or institutional bias against black or ethnic minorities. So I'm aware of research, for example, it's quite old now, admittedly, but by an Afro-Caribbean psychiatrist called Fred Hickling, where he looked at the rates of admission for psychosis in Jamaica and in Afro-Caribbeans in America, in London, and they were essentially the same. So there wasn't evidence from that, at least, that there was a preferential, banging up of Afro-Caribbeans in London with psychotic symptoms or psychotic
I was told a story about Fred Hickling, about when he came to London.
Yeah.
But do you know what happened to him after he arrived?
Not sure.
I heard this from Robin Murray, so I hope it's true.
Probably is.
He was driving a big hire car in from the airport. He got arrested. because he'd already left his
Yeah.
passport in his hotel, could
Right.
prove where he was. They didn't believe that he could possibly be Professor Hinckley driving a big, expensive car,
Yeah.
which tells you something about the experience of black people in this
Well, absolutely.